Today's presentation is going to be on the founding of the Jamestown tribal community. I know we've talked in past presentations kind of building up towards this point and giving you sort of a background history through the archaeology and ethnography of the early S'quałam villages in the Esquimalt area. Today what I'm going to be talking specifically about is how those various tribal communities came together and formed the Jamestown S'quałam tribal community. This picture you can see is actually from Jamestown Beach Road, probably around the 1890s. So to get started, I'm going to use a little bit of a timeline to run you through the steps that led up to the founding of Jamestown, but I'm not going to go all the way back to time immemorial. We've spent a couple presentations covering all of that material. So for the purposes of today's presentation, we're going to start in the late 1700s, which is when Chief Statiethlam the Elder was the chief of the Statiethlam, who lived at the village of Statiethlam, where the red number 4 is on the map on the left side of this screen. You can see these red dots. So to the far left, the red number 1 is Tzatzich, which was a small village on Klein Spit. Number 2 is Tzetskät, which was a very large S'quałam village located on a bluff overlooking the mouth of the Dungeness River. Number 3, there are a couple different names for this settlement. The most common one was actually Tsuk, which was also the name given to the S'quałam name for the Dungeness River, which meant cloudy or muddy, and was a reference to the muddy area at the mouth of the river. Then moving east, number 4 was the village site of Statiethlam. Number 5 is where the Jamestown village was founded, and that's what I'm going to be talking about today. The red number 6 is Chikwing, the S'quałam village that was at the entrance to Squim Bay, where Washington Harbor and Battelle MSL laboratories are today. And then number 7, Squakwalth, was the name of the S'quałam village on Discovery Bay. So I mentioned Statiethlam the Elder was the traditional chief of the Statiethlam Nuscayam in the late 1700s. His son was also named Statiethlam and became the hereditary chief after he was, and married the princess of Nanaimo, Tsaskinakin, and they had 7 sons and a daughter, Yawitsa. And that story you can find in the 7 Sons of Statiethlam, written by Marianne Lambert, who's a Jamestown S'quałam tribal ancestor. In 1790, Manuel Quimper is one of the first Europeans to sail this far into the strait, and actually has a really good documented account of interacting and trading with the S'quałam at Dungeness and Discovery Bays. Traded with the S'quałam, especially lots of venison, elk meat, and then seafood. The sailors were really happy to get some fresh meat on the boat. Skipping forward a little bit, in 1828, the Hudson Bay Company ship Cadborough was sent on a punitive mission against the S'quałam, and ended up attacking and shelling the village of Statiethlam, again where number 4 is on the map, destroying most of the village. The village was rebuilt at that point and reoccupied for roughly about another 20 years. But then eventually that village site was shifted over to Katai, where Port Townsend is today. In 1851, Chief Cheechmahan, who was the grandson of Statiethlam, visited San Francisco. At that time, the first non-natives also began arriving in the Esquimalt Valley and settling on the prairies along Dungeness Bay and Squim Prairie. The map on the left side actually shows you that early historic agricultural development. You can see the bright orange blobs are actually the prairies themselves as they were recorded by the General Land Office in the 1850s. The lighter orange blocks within those prairies are the actual first farms and farming settlements founded in Squim Dungeness. The green dots are actually homes, And what you'll see is if you compare that map to the map that we were just looking at on the previous slide, if you look at that cluster of villages right there around the mouth of the Dungeness, most of this early historic settlement and development happened right there around those early village sites. And one of the primary reasons for that is those villages were closely associated with the prairies, because the prairies were essentially their gardens. That's where the camas, tiger lily, chegger lily, bracken fern, there's a whole suite of plants that the S'Klallam not only ate themselves, but also heavily traded to other tribes. Those were the first sites that were settled by non-natives when they arrived at Dungeness. And so you can see in 1858, we already start getting documentation in the annual reports to the Commissioner of Indian Affairs, specifically saying the Dungeness S'Klallam Indians say that the whites are taking their potato grounds and will not let them get firewood, etc., in the accustomed places. So within 7 years of the first non-natives arriving in the Dungeness Valley, you already have documentation of this conflict of, there's a finite amount of resources, and essentially the S'Klallam were being forced off of their traditional territories, their traditional prairies, and their village sites by these farmers. In 1860, the annual report documents that the S'Klallam of Dungeness at that point were actually expecting an attack from the northern tribes in Canada. There was a lot of intertribal warfare going on throughout the early to mid-19th century. Most of the S'Klallam villages by the 1840s had an actual defensive palisade built around the village itself. I'm going to go ahead and make sure I have everybody muted here. And there was as far back as 1851, we start seeing documentation of that intertribal warfare in a Dungeness chief, xʷЛč, was killed in a battle out on Dungeness Spit in 1851. In 1860, there was more intertribal warfare going on with the tribes to the north, and this continued till about 1868. In 1861, for the first time since the treaty was signed in 1855, the S'Klallam received their annuity goods, which were promised in the treaty to be distributed to them. In 1862, the second annuity payment was actually $2,200 short of what had been promised to the S'Klallam in the treaty. And basically every year after this, it's a litany of complaints by the Skokomish Indian Agency about the fact that every time the federal government sent the annuity payments to be dispersed amongst the S'Klallam, Skokomish, and Chimicum tribes, that not only was the money short of what was expected from the treaty, but the money was short from the actual invoice that the Indian agent received. So somewhere between Washington, D.C. and the Skokomish Reservation, $200 or $300 disappeared that fast. So this money was being siphoned off anywhere except for where it was supposed to go, which was to the tribes as annuity treaty payments. In 1866, the annual report to the Commissioner of Indian Affairs documents that the present administration of affairs failed to reach and correct the abuse, alcohol abuse and illicit supplying of whiskey and liquor to not just the S'Klallam at Dungeness, but also at Kittai and Port Townsend and Port Angeles. And the specific reason for that was the numerous Indian camps along the straits are so accessible by means of boats from Vancouver's Island that unprincipled parties can carry on a whiskey trade with impunity. And this continued to a point where a couple years later, the Skokomish Indian Agency actually recommended that a secret police force be formed in order to stop the bootlegging coming from the other side of the border in Canada. That idea was never taken up, but it was a huge problem. Again, in 1867, documented in the annual report to Commissioner on Indian Affairs, the S'Klallam remain in about the same condition as my last report. Their general health continues to be bad, and many of them have died within the past year, and unless something can be done to relieve them by medical aid or otherwise, they will very soon disappear. It's worth noting that in the 1860s, there was another round of epidemics that spread throughout all of the Coast Salish tribes around the Salish Sea. And in the period between roughly 1855 and 1870, the slalom population was cut roughly in half by roughly about 50%, went from what we've documented in early census records of at least 2,000 to 2,500 people. By the late 1860s, there were 1,000 or less slalom. In 1868, the Dungeness Massacre on Graveyard Spit was intertribal warfare between the Dungeness Slalom and a group of 18 Tsimshian Indians who were staying out on the spit on their way back to Columbia. This was a retaliatory raid for the capture of a slalom woman who is the wife of one of the Dungeness slalom. They had captured his wife years previously and held her in slavery. And so when this group was seen camping out on the spit, the Dungeness slalom went out and attacked them. As a result of that, that was sort of the last act of intertribal warfare on the Olympic Peninsula. I think it was about 16 men were sent to the Skokomish Reservation, where they served 6 months of hard labor with ball and chain. Then in 1870, Edward Curtis recorded a really detailed account of the final potlatch held at Näxʷŋəyaʔáw, the village on Squim Bay. We have subsequent accounts of potlatches held at Jamestown in the late 1870s, and then there was a potlatch in 1891 at Port Hadlock on Port Townsend Bay. And those are the last documented, really traditional potlatches that we have in the historic record. In 1871, the ship What Cheer arrived in the Strait of Juan de Fuca from San Francisco. The crew was infected with smallpox. As they reached our end of the strait, they started discarding clothing that belonged to some of the deceased infected crew overboard. In the traditional story, the slalom traditional stories, some of that clothing washed up near a village site, was picked up by members of that village, and then they contracted the disease. And according to those stories, that resulted in the decimation of the Näxʷŋəyaʔáw slalom population by at least half. And the captain of that ship, What Cheer, Captain Thompson, is actually buried out at Thompson Spit, just north of Diamond Point, if you're familiar with that area. And you've been out there, you can see his grave is marked out at that location. That's where Captain Thompson came from. The map on the left side is just to show you again, this is a map created from the 1855 GLO survey maps. And you can see even this early on in 1855, there had been non-native agricultural settlement on the Squim Dungeness floodplain for 4 years at that point. And you can see there's extensive cultivated fields out on the prairies. At this point, the slalom were still living in their traditional villages at Sausage, Tsetsakat, and Statithlam. However, they had farm settlements right next to the village with these huge cultivated fields, and the cultivated fields took over the areas where traditionally the slalom harvested not just camas, but then through the early 1800s were growing potatoes, which were introduced by the Spanish out at Nia Bay when they built a small fort that was only there for a few months. They had a garden out there. They introduced what are now called Ozette potatoes. Those potatoes were then traded throughout the Salish Sea between different tribes. And potato cultivation is very, very similar to camas cultivation. And it's a very low intensity form of agriculture. However, in addition to cultivating these fields, the non-native farmers who settled in the Squim Dungeness Valley also brought in livestock, specifically swine and cattle. And one of the things that they would do, and this is a pretty average thing in Western agriculture back in the day, was especially in late summer, fall, you would let the swine, your pigs, out on the prairie and out into the forest to basically forage for whatever they can eat previous to winter. One of the first things that the pigs go out and dig up and eat are all of the nice rich camas bulbs all over the prairie. So from a very early date, you have agricultural system that Sklallam life was oriented around, and their village sites were located around. So in 1872 was when Indian agent Edwin Eales from the Skokomish Agency recommended the establishment of a vigilant secret police force. Edwin Eales' brother, Myron Eales, was a Protestant Congregationalist missionary who also lived at the Skokomish Agency and interacted quite often with not just the Skokomish and Tawana peoples down on Hood Canal, but also with the Sklallam and the Makah. And it's worth noting, a lot of the early documentation we have from Jamestown actually comes from both Edwin Eales as Indian agent and then Myron Eales' accounts. And I wanted to read a quick quote from a book called Tawana Narratives by William Elmendorf, who interviewed Frank and Henry Allen, who were Skokomish tribal ancestors, but their mother was a Dungeness Sklallam. And so a lot of the information that they relayed to Elmendorf was specific to life at Dungeness, the Dungeness villages in Jamestown. And I always chuckle at a single quote from this book when they're talking about Myron Eales living on the reservation. Let me try and track this down real quick. Essentially, Myron Eales, and you can read a lot of his writings. He has a book called The Indians of Puget Sound, the Notebooks of Myron Eales, where he goes into great, not great detail, but basically has these little grammar and pronunciation guides on different Coast Salish languages. And in Hank and Friendly Allen's account, they talk about how quite a few people actually did not like Myron Eales, and when he would walk around, when he would walk around the village site, interviewing different tribal peoples, asking them...
David, you muted yourself.
Oh, I did not mean to mute myself. I meant to mute everybody else. Sorry. He noted that when Myron Eales was going around the village asking people how to say words for things like dog, cat, house, tree, things like that, that the people actually taught him a lot of very dirty words. And then when he went around using those words in conversation, that he was the butt of a lot of jokes. So it just goes to show you got to kind of read the accounts that were given by the non-natives at that time through the lens of they're not speaking about their own culture and their own history. And you're viewing this history through the lens of somebody who doesn't necessarily understand everything that they're looking at. So with that said, in 1874, the way that the Indian agent explained the founding of Jamestown was the Sklallam still object to coming onto the reservation. A portion of them near Dungeness, numbering about 100, have made up a purse and purchased a tract of land and settled upon it. They prefer to do so and cut themselves off from the benefits of the treaty rather than to move onto the reservation. Within the year, under my direction, they have organized a police force and have punished drunkenness among themselves quite severely and with good effect. And the sketch at the top of this screen was the first house built by Chief James Balch at the village of Jamestown. But this account is actually the account given by Joe Johnson, a tribal ancestor from the Johnson family of the Jamestown Sklallam tribe, given to ethnographer Erna Gunther, who was interviewing tribal ancestors in the early 1920s as she was researching for her Sklallam ethnography, which she published in 1927. And what Joe talks about is it wasn't just moving to Jamestown because they didn't want to move to the reservation. Per Joe's account, they lived on the hill at McAlmond Place, where the McAlmond House is today, the village site of Sescat. Elijah McAlmond homesteaded that site through the Donation Act, claimed a couple hundred acres as his homestead, and then forced the tribe to move off of their ancestral village site overlooking the mouth of the Dungeness. They then moved across the river to the east side of the Dungeness River, what's now known as Dungeness proper. Then that area was homesteaded by another non-native farmer. They were told again that they had to move. At that point, James Balch knew the man who owned land at Jamestown and asked if the tribe could buy it. Chief Balch went to Skokomish, spoke to Edwin Eales, who advised him that they should go ahead and purchase that property. So James Balch, Chubby, and Johnson went over and actually took a look at the land. The property owner at that time, his last name was Delante. He had bought the land to log it, had a logging camp roughly of the west side of where Jamestown is today. He said that he would sell it to the tribe if he could keep his right-of-way and finish removing the timber from the property. He withheld the title until they had finished the logging. About a dozen tribal families roughly pulled together $500 in gold coin and used that to purchase about 210 acres of land. The land was all originally deeded to James Balch, the chief. Joe Johnson went over with Delante and found a good farming site. A few years later, they realized that James Balch had the deed to all of the property, so at that point they had it surveyed, divided, and each lot was deeded to individual owners, and each lot was apportioned to those families based on how much money they pulled into that pot of $500. There was one corner on the west side that was left over as a graveyard, which actually, I'll talk about this in a few slides, but they actually purchased that land for the graveyard 2 years later in 1876. The S'Klallam name for Jamestown, which I can't pronounce, so I'm not going to try, actually means white firs or silver firs because that was the predominant tree growing in that area. And according to Johnson's account, he immediately cleared some land, planted potatoes, had a good crop, and then that sort of spread throughout the community. And that was also documented by Edwin Eales and Myron Eales. As soon as the tribe bought the Jamestown settlement, one of the first things that Edwin and Myron Eales did was sent up a shipment from the Skokomish Reservation with some sapling apple trees, pear trees, cherry trees to help the Jamestown S'Klallam start orchards, as well as seed for agricultural produce. And then, per what we talked about in previous slides, the tribe continued their tradition of growing potatoes, which was something that they had done for the last 50 years before founding Jamestown very successfully. And those potatoes were grown not just for the tribe's use, but then a lot of those were actually shipped over to Victoria on Vancouver Island and over to the growing settlements at Port Townsend and Seattle and sold in the markets there, along with a large amount of elk and venison that was hunted on the Squim Prairies. So just a couple of the folks that I've been mentioning and will be mentioning through these slides. On the top left is Joe Johnson, who gave us the account that I just read and was one of the original founders of Jamestown. In the middle image is Billy Newton, Cookhouse Billy, another one of the founding families of Jamestown. And on the far right is Captain Charles and Celia Hall, who were actually originally from Discovery Bay. And then the Hall family then moved to Jamestown also in the 1870s, 1880s. These photos were taken by Edmund S. Meany in 1905, and you can find them in the UW Special Collections. So I mentioned the apportionment of lots. The original 17 S'Klallam families who contributed to the purchase of Jamestown were Lord Jim Balch, or James Balch, and his wife, Siamitza, Cookhouse Billy Newton, who we saw in the previous slide, and his wife, Annie Newton. Annie Newton was actually the sister of Joe Johnson. Joe Johnson, who we saw in the previous slide, and his wife, Lily. And Lily's maiden name was Roberts, and Lily Roberts was actually from the S'Klallam village site over on Discovery Bay. Old Chubby and his wife, Maggie. Maggie Chubby was also one of Joe Johnson's sisters. Old Collier, who was the father of Robert Collier, who I'll talk about a little bit more in a couple slides. Tanis Little John and his wife Nagoti, who I believe their descendants are now tribal citizens and descendants of the Port Gamble Squam tribe, though I could be incorrect on that. Skookum, Big John, Dr. John and Mary, Carpenter John and wife Sally, who in later records are John Carpenter and Sally Carpenter. Squim Mike Wood and his wife Hiwichsa. Mike Wood was the father of Dan and Leonard Wood. Tanis Joe, Big Mouth Bill Williams and his wife Maria, who were the ancestors of the Allen family of the Jamestown Squam tribe. Old Slays and his wife Tiatino, who were Jamestown Squam, but their descendants are actually citizens of the tribal communities over at on the south end of Vancouver Island today. And it's worth noting, there were 17 original families. Most of the tribal citizens and descendants of the Jamestown Squam tribe today are descended from these individuals, but not all of these families remained at Jamestown through the next 20 to 30 years, and some of these families did move to Port Gamble Squam and Lower Elwha Clallam communities, and their descendants can be found there today. The image on the right side of your screen is one of the original plat maps of the Jamestown settlement. So the tribal cemetery is the small triangular wedge in the top left, the U survey plat there. You can see that the lots kind of, for the most part, grow progressively larger as you move from west to east. And when you get all the way over to the east side, Lot A, that was the lot that was apportioned to James Balch and his wife Siamitsa as contributing the largest portion of the gold coin to purchase the Jamestown settlement. And the James Balch's grave can be found on that parcel still today at the north end of Wilcox Road, where it intersects with Jamestown Beach Road. They intersect in a corner right there at the north end of that property, and there's a small totem pole there in his honor as well. So if you drive down Jamestown Beach Road today, when you get to the very end of the road, you see that totem pole. That's where the chief's grave is. So this is a really interesting account from the Puget Sound Weekly Argus newspaper from July of 1876. So we're coming up on the anniversary of quite a few marriages. And it's worth noting that these couples were married according to Squam traditional beliefs prior to this date. However, this mass marriage in 1876 was part of that process of integrating the Jamestown Squam into the Western system of governance in terms of records keeping, assessor maps, survey records, land records, property records. It's worth noting that Native Americans were not considered United States citizens until 1924. However, the Jamestown tribe was able to purchase this land. 2 years later, in 1876, Reverend Eels, who I mentioned earlier, came up from the Skokomish Reservation and actually married James Balch and his wife Siamitsa, married Chubby Tamagi, married Carpenter John and Sally, so that there were official church records of Christian marriages of these individuals, so that it was documented. This image that you see in the background of the screen, the second person from the left, that's Billy Newton wearing the beaded bag with the horse. The woman seated just to his right with her hand raised is his wife Maggie. I confess I'm not entirely sure who most of the other individuals in this photo are. The woman seated on the far right with the child in her arms is Mary Hunter Hall Wood. She was the granddaughter of Chief James Balch and the daughter of Reverend Billy Hall. And her descendants are among the Wood, Johnson, Prince, and Hall families of the Jamestown S'quallam tribe today. I just mentioned Mary Hunter Hallwood. Her older brother was Captain Billy Hall. Her parents were Captain Charles Hall and Celia Hall, who I showed a couple slides ago. There were 3 brothers, and Mary was a sister. David Prince was the grandson of Chief Chichmahan, and he actually moved his family to Jamestown, I believe in the 1920s, and purchased one of the lots there at Jamestown and started a dairy farm there. Amy Allen, again descended from Big Mouth Bill Williams and Maria Williams, lived at Jamestown, and her descendants are the Allen family of Jamestown tribe today. And then Robert Collier, who is the son of Old Collier, who was a very important medicine man in the 18th century. He married Martha Collier, who you can see in this photo, and they had 2 daughters. And the Collier family of the Jamestown tribe today are descended from Robert and Martha Collier. Also from the Puget Sound Weekly Argus in September of 1876, this little excerpt talking about the founding of Jamestown, though it gives 160 acres, which is incorrect. Talks about how at that point it was this small but growing farming community established by the Jamestown S'quallam. This photo, I'm not sure the exact date, but it has to be the late 1800s, early 1900s, because we can see the church steeple there to the right. What I like about this photo, so the gentleman standing there drawing in the sand with his stick is Captain Charles Hall. I'm not sure who the other 2 S'quallam gentlemen are, but you can see behind them these structures going down the beach, these sort of shed-style structures, and those were used both to house canoes. You can see the crab traps piled up on the beach. Fishing and crabbing was one of the primary economic ventures of the Jamestown S'quallam. And so that was one of the reasons why those lots were apportioned to those long, linear plots, is because every family needed some beach frontage to pull their canoe up on and have access to their traditional maritime resources. You can see Jamestown Beach Road today runs exactly down where this sandy path in the beach was back 100 years ago. And then just on the south side of that, there was this nice wooden picket fence. That's roughly where people's yards start today at Jamestown. This is a closer photo of Captain Charles Hall, who, as I mentioned, was originally from Discovery Bay, moved to Jamestown, and was actually the last of the traditional canoe carvers amongst the Jamestown S'quallam tribe. And he's sitting here in one of the last canoes that he carved. The Jamestown Indian Shaker Church was, so there was a small church built in the 1870s when the original Jamestown S'quallam settlement started. In 1892, that small sort of log cabin structure was rebuilt into this really nice Indian Shaker Church. Albert Barnes took this photo sometime between 1900 and 1906. But you can see these, it's got very distinctive architectural features around the eaves and the edge of the roof that we can identify in later photos. There was also a schoolhouse built, and so it was actually the Jamestown S'quallam Village site was the site of the first church and the first schools in S'quallam County. As I mentioned previously, in 1876, the tribe purchased 2.9 acres of additional land there at the west end of the Jamestown settlement for $2 in gold coin for use as the tribal cemetery, which is the tribal cemetery that the Jamestown S'quallam tribe still uses today and is currently actually reservation land, Jamestown reservation land down there at Jamestown Beach. In 1878 was when that first small church was built that I mentioned. In 1890, the Indian Shaker Church was introduced to Jamestown. The Indian Shaker religion started with John Slocum down at, he was a Squaxin Indian from down at the south end of Puget Sound. And the Indian Shaker religion was sort of a synthesis of traditional shamanistic practices overlaid on parts of rites of the Catholic Mass, which John Slocum had a history growing up in the Catholic Church, and through a series of events in his life and the miracle where he was brought back twice from the dead, the second time by his wife Mary shaking over him and praying, started this new religion that sort of combined some of those traditional practices with Christian religious practices, and gave Coast Salish tribal peoples a way to continue their traditional religious beliefs within a Christian form that was accepted by the non-natives that were rapidly moving into this area and at this point outpopulating the Native Americans. In 1910, there was a new government school built at Jamestown with a bell and a teacher's cottage. The school is gone today, but if you drive down Jamestown Beach Road, when you get to Jake Hall or Cemetery Road, just on the west side of that intersection, you can see there's a 4 or 5 acre parcel with a small red barn and a red house. That small red house is the caretaker's cottage from the government school, and that barn was part of that campus. And the Jamestown tribe today still uses a well that was established on that property. And that government well was part of the documentation that the Jamestown tribe used in the 1970s when they were applying for federal recognition, to show that the government had been providing services to the Jamestown tribe as far back as the early 1900s. In 1912, the second larger Jamestown Shaker Church was built, and this church stood until for about 30 or 40 years and then ended up burning down in the mid-20th century. And that church was built on a corner of land donated by Joe Johnson about halfway down Jamestown Beach Road, which I can show you on this map. So what I've done here is taken the 1930 Clallam County tax assessor maps, and I've overlaid on that the names of what tribal families were living on what parcels in 1913 based on contemporary accounts of people who were living there as it looked when they traveled down Jamestown Beach Road. So you can see again there on the west end, the Jamestown Cemetery. I've got the school campus highlighted. So the schoolhouse, which was right at the corner of where the road is today, is gone. But that cottage and the barn, which are the two structures on the west side of that red box, those are still there today. That road today is Jake Hall Road. You can see Jacob Hall's name there highlighted. There's still members, tribal citizens of the Hall family who live on portions of that property. There's also members of the Johnson family who still live on portions of the property that belong to Dan and Mike Wood, right there at kind of the northwest corner of the settlement. You can see the property belonging to David Prince just to the west of Mike Wood. Then moving east, you've got Johnson Williams, Charles Hall, who I showed you in pictures of in the previous slide, the last traditional canoe carver. Mary Hunter, Charles's daughter, who I showed you in previous pictures holding the child. Just to the east of Mary was Cookhouse Billy Newton and his wife Maggie. Just to the east of Cookhouse Billy was Wilson Johnson, who is the son of Joe Johnson, who I spoke about earlier. Just to the east of Wilson Johnson was Joe Allen, who was the son of Amy Allen, who I showed in previous pictures, and then Jimmy Dick. The Dick family was another Jamestown Squam family that actually moved from the Chiquing Village site at Washington Harbor. Around 1894, they purchased land at Jamestown. Just to the east of them, Howard Chubby, the son of Old Chubby. Just to the east of the Chubbies was David Prince and the property that he purchased, I believe it was actually in 1912, established his dairy farm. Just to the east of David Prince, Robert Collier, the son of Old Collier. And then just to the east of Robert Collier was Ida Hall. Ida was the daughter of Chief James Balch and his wife Siamitsa. And what's really cool is we found this photo hiding in the back of a filing cabinet in our tribal library a couple months ago that actually has a large number of those original founders of the Jamestown S'quam community. This photo was taken in 1925 during the meetings of the S'quam Executive Committee, which met to determine membership within the S'quam tribes in preparation for annuity and payments from the federal government to make up for those annuity payments that were promised in the treaty and never happened. And so, unfortunately, we haven't managed to identify everybody in this photo. We think some of the individuals were from the Lower Elwha, Clallam, and Port Gamble S'quam communities, and so we're going to be doing some outreach to them to see if they can identify some of the faces we don't have names for. But number one, John Solomon. The Solomons were from the village of Tseskat, and they were strongly rooted in a lot of their ancestors were medicine men or shamans. Number two, Dan Wood was the son of Squim Mike Wood. Mike Wood was from the village of Chiquing on Washington Harbor, but then he and his wife actually were two of the original founding purchasers of Jamestown S'quam tribe. Dan Wood, you can definitely notice him in every old picture because he's taller than everybody else in the picture, and was actually widely known as one of the best baseball players in the area. So fun little fact there. Number three, the gentleman just down into the right of the number three wearing the glasses is John Cook, who's the ancestor of the Cook family of the Jamestown S'quam tribe today. Just to the right of John Cook is Billy Hall. Billy was the oldest son of Charles and Celia Hall. He was a famous Indian Shaker minister who actually conducted some very impressive miracles during his time as sort of the leader of the Indian Shaker ministry at Jamestown. Just to the right of Billy is Joe Johnson, who I've spoken at length about. Then moving way back over to the left again, Ida Balch Hall was the daughter of Chief James Balch and inherited that land at the far east end of Jamestown from Chief James Balch. Ida married Billy Hall, Reverend Billy Hall, number 4, and their descendants are amongst the Hall family of the Jamestown S'quam tribe today. Number 7, Susie Chubby Solomon was married to John Solomon for number 1. Number 8 is Mary Hall Hunter Wood, who I've mentioned many times in previous slides. Mary actually had multiple children she was first married to Martin Hunter and had 2 children, Lizzie Hunter and David Hunter. Lizzie Hunter married David Prince, and their descendants are the Prince family of the Jamestown S'quam tribe today. Her second marriage was to Dan Wood, where they had, I believe, 4 children, including Ethel Wood. Ethel Wood married Wilson Johnson, the son of Joe and Lily Johnson, and their children are the tribal citizens of the Wood Johnson family of the Jamestown S'quam tribe today. And then Mary Hunter had a third marriage, which I'm not going to get into for the purposes of this presentation. Number 9, Annie George, I believe her descendants are Port Gamble S'quam tribe today. Number 10, Lily Johnson, is Joe Johnson's wife. And then the lowest row, number 11, Nora Johnson Cook. She's from a different Johnson family from out at the east end of the Strait of Juan de Fuca. She was married to John Cook, and she's the direct ancestor of the Cook family of Jamestown Squam tribe. Number 12, Mary Chubby Sullivan. The Chubby family and Sullivan families were from Jamestown, but as far as I know, and again, I could be incorrect on this, most descendants of the Sullivan family are tribal citizens and descendants of the Port Gamble Squam tribe today. 13, maybe Amy Williams Allen. We're not 100% on that. And then number 14, Martha Chubby Dick Collier, was the daughter of Robert Collier, who I mentioned earlier. I like this picture because it kind of helps show that the Indian Shaker Church at Jamestown was really the focal point of the Jamestown community. You know, as those traditional practices of potlatching were really outlawed by the Indian Agency and subverted, what happened was you had the Indian Shaker Church became sort of the focal point of the community, and there were these Indian Shaker Church conventions hosted at different tribal communities around the Salish Sea, Puget Sound region. Different tribes would host the convention every year, and there was a large convention hosted in the 1920s. I believe it was 1922, but I could be incorrect on that, at Jamestown, and that's these photos are part of a series of photos that we have from that convention. Really cool detail, and I'm not going to start naming all of the individuals in this photo, but suffice to say that a lot of those Jamestown Squam ancestors are in these photos, including the people we just looked at in the last slide. So again, coming into the 20th century, this is a photo of what that Jamestown government school campus looked like. Into the 1930s, you can see that there were still a couple of those sort of cabin structures left on the beach, but most of them had disappeared. You can still see the steeple from the Shaker Church there in the background. However, that Shaker Church ended up burning, I believe, in the 1940s and was never rebuilt. Moving into sort of the contemporary era, you can see from these photos in the 1970s, the crab shack built by Harris Brick Johnson was the last of those traditional structures built there on the beach. And that structure was actually used, you can see on the left side of the screen, Brick would host these clam bakes and salmon bakes down on the beach, and you can see there were little stools set up. That crab shack was actually sort of a little beach shack, if you will, where they served salmon and clams to, sold salmon and clams to visitors. So that wraps it up right on time at 3:50. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen there.